As some of you know, I like to keep up with different sides of the political spectrum, which includes this video that I saw recently about gay people condemning the LGBTQ+ community, where some people are becoming conservative. You know that feeling, right? It's like when you were bullied alongside this whole group of other kids, but then you decide maybe some of those kids actually deserve to get bullied because you think they're weird, so you try to team up with the bully. Except the bully will definitely keep making fun of you to your face. Sure, the bully's awful to me, but everybody has hardships. I mean, look how much worse he is to those other kids. Maybe if I just keep supporting him to keep bullying those other kids, he'll finally leave me alone. The leopards won't rip off my face, surely. I'm siding with them after all. This is obviously gonna go well for me. And sure, I get why it happens. People want to feel like they're on the winning side, as if they're not the actual real target. But in case you need a reminder, homophobic people will never truly be on your side. You think that if you distance yourself just enough for those gays in the LGBTQ+ community that you'll be spared? You can wrap yourself up in as much respectability as you want, but homophobia still sees you as exactly what you are. A fucking weirdo who threatens normalcy. It's like jumping on a boat that has a giant hole in it, but if you side with the engineers that made that hole, surely the boat won't sink you along with everybody else. Because homophobia always ends up spreading hate towards straight people too. Just like transphobia spreads hate to cisgendered people. When push comes to shove, homophobia does not make exceptions. It doesn't suddenly draw the line at a respectable gay who criticizes the LGBTQ+ community. So while you might get a nod here and there, the sad reality is that you've aligned yourself with people who, given half the chance, wouldn't hesitate to throw you in front of a speeding semi-truck on fire. That's why siding with the leopards never work. You're only delaying the inevitable. The whole thing makes me wonder how we got here, like parts of the LGBTQ+ community turn against each other like it's some sort of survival strategy, because it doesn't stop at gay conservatives. I've especially noticed that people who believe themselves to be progressive gays and lesbians sometimes look down on others in the LGBTQ+ spectrum. Biphobia, for example, is a real issue that just keeps getting ignored or brushed aside. Biphobia is not just something bi and pan people have to face from the straight folks, it's something that's wondrously thriving in the LGBTQ+ community too. There's this stereotype that bi and pan people are confused or undecided, as if you harass them just enough, they'll make a real choice. And who usually reinforces this stereotype? It's often gay and lesbian people, ironically enough. You'd think they'd understand what it feels like to have your identity questioned or dismissed, but instead bi and pan people end up being treated like they're playing both sides. They're less faithful, they're more likely to cheat. Ooh, that's very close. Actually, if a bi or pan person cheats, they're actually just a terrible human being. Isn't that like common sense? If a straight man cheats on his wife with another woman, is it because he's straight? No. Is it because he's a man? Arguably no. A bi or pan person is no more likely to cheat than anyone else, I'm afraid. It's like people just can't seem to wrap their heads around the idea that someone can be attracted to more than one gender without constantly feeling tempted to stray. This adds a lot of pressure, like when they're constantly on trial expected to show their sexuality isn't a threat to monogamy or stability. The irony here is pretty rich too. Bi and pan people are attracted to people across the gender spectrum because of their openness and acceptance, yet they're frequently met with doubts and distrust. Instead of embracing bisexuality and pansexuality as a valid identity, people reduce it to a risky personality trait, ignoring the fact that relationships are built on mutual trust, not on assumptions about who someone might be attracted to. One of the most harmful effects of biphobia is how it discourages bi and pan people from being open about their identity. I mean, because if someone's already dealing with judgment from the straight society, why would they want to walk into an LGBTQ+ space and face the same thing from their own community? Instead of the LGBTQ+ community being a safe space, it just becomes another place where they have to justify their existence. There are a lot of certain gay and lesbian people who act like bi and pan individuals don't really belong in LGBTQ+ spaces. They'll question whether a bi or pan person should be even a part of the community, especially if they're in a straight passing relationship. You'll hear comments like, if you're dating someone the opposite gender, then you're straight, pretending to be gay. It's as if the validity of bi and pan identities is judged solely by who someone's dating at the moment. In my own life, I am in a straight passing relationship, and I am very grateful to be with a person I can love openly without fear of backlash. But the fact that we pass as straight doesn't mean we don't belong in conversations about pride or embracing our sexuality, because neither of us identify as straight. Instead, we're dismissed as, ugh, you don't count, your relationship isn't persecuted. Just because someone isn't visibly queer enough by someone else's standards doesn't mean who they are is any less valid than that other person. Why should people who doesn't fit the stereotypical mold of looking gay have to prove themselves to anyone? Why are bi people expected to date an equal number of men and women to be actually bisexual? It's honestly ridiculous that LGBTQ plus people have to constantly prove themselves to other LGBTQ plus members. Like, why are trans people pressured, even by other trans folk, to undergo surgeries to prove that they're committed to their identities, as if they genuinely don't want to transition unless they're willing to risk everything? It's baffling to witness this kind of gatekeeping in a community that's supposed to be built on acceptance. It's deeply upsetting to see trans influence who themselves criticize other trans people, saying things like, if you don't want bottom surgery, you're not actually trans, and then wonder to themselves why trans kids feel pressured to undergo bottom surgeries. Well, it's your fault. That's why. The confusion and judgment only contribute to this harmful narrative. I've seen so many gay people argue that LGB people shouldn't be grouped with TQ people because LGB are about sexual orientation and TQ is about gender identity, which is already wrong without even deep diving into it. The argument that LGB people are purely sexualities while TQ people are just about gender ignores the fact that Q, which stands for queer, is also a sexuality. Queer is an umbrella term that encompasses people whose sexual orientation doesn't fit into like a traditional category of straight. And guess what? Queer people's sexualities aren't any more complicated than LGB people's. It's just that these labels allow people to express their sexualities in a way that break out of the binary. If we're going to say that LGB people should be separated from TQ because LGB is a sexuality, then we're also inadvertently leaving out other sexual identities too, like asexual or aromantic, which fall under the plus category. But sure, let's deep dive into their argument that these people make gender complicated when there's only two genders. In a previous video, I already talked about how the two genders argument isn't really valid because there are people who are intersex, people who are biologically both or neither male or female. Intersex people are biologically a part of our species, and they completely disrupt the whole there's only two genders argument. Intersex individuals are born with physical or genetic traits that don't really fit the typical definitions of male or female bodies. That isn't some niche phenomenon either. Intersex variations are about as common as natural redheads. So when people insist that there are only two genders because it's just biology, they're conveniently ignoring the fact that actual scientific evidence that proves otherwise. If biology can show that sex isn't binary, why is it so hard for people to accept that gender might not also be binary either? Now on to the argument that TQ plus people complicate things for the LGB folks. Look, I know that it can get very confusing at first, but let's not forget that people once thought that being gay and lesbian was complicated and unnatural too. Society has a long history of labeling anything outside of the traditional cisgender heterosexual norms as confusing, weird, or too complicated. They call women a binary gender complicated and weird. The same battles that the LGBT community fought to have their relationships recognized as valid are the battles that trans and non-binary people are fighting now. Non-binary people are just people with opinions. Non-binary people are real, and their existence is supported by science. Gender dysphoria, which many non-binary and trans people experience, is a recognized medical condition. Studies from reputable organizations like the American Psychological Association and the American Medical Association confirm that providing gender-affirming care, including using correct pronouns, is vital for the mental health and well-being of these individuals. Sure, misgendering can be a point of the soft liberals, but misgendering has been scientifically proven to cause severe psychological distress. It's been shown repeatedly in studies that respecting someone's gender identity, including their pronouns, can significantly lower their risk of depression, anxiety, and even suicide. The binary view of gender is outdated because science shows that gender is indeed a spectrum. Gender identity is influenced by a combination of biological factors like chromosomes and hormones, and social factors like cultural expectations and personal experiences. Some people have XX chromosomes and present as female, others have XY chromosomes and present as male. But then there are also variations of chromosomes, like people with the Klinefelter syndrome, XXY, or Turner syndrome, which is just X. People who don't fit neatly into male or female categories. So trying to force everyone into a male or female box is not only scientifically incorrect, but also erases the existence of people who have been around for as long as humanity itself. By separating TQ plus from LGB, you are literally doing the work of oppressors for them, while undoing all the work of people who brought you yours. You are falling into the same exclusionary tactics that were used against gay, lesbian, and bisexual people for eons. You are playing into the idea that there's a right kind of queer person who deserves respect and rights and a wrong kind of person who doesn't. I don't know if you know this, but it's actually completely fine if you don't understand people who transition. But transphobia does not only affect trans people. Because no, you can't always tell. If you spread trans hate, there will be someone who is more hateful who will spread that hate to you. Trans people already face such ridiculous amount of scrutiny from the people who should be allies. There are all these unwritten rules trans people are expected to follow to prove their identity, and instead of validating them, it only adds to the weight they're already carrying. I don't know if people are aware of this, but this sort of behavior is actively fuels the same patriarchy we're all supposed to be fighting against. Like, this song about a trans girl journey is nothing like my journey as a woman. Obviously not. You're not trans. You're cis. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being cisgendered, obviously. But, of course, your experience of womanhood will look different than a trans woman's. Her girlhood is about finally finding beauty in life after years of not being able to express herself. You've always had that freedom. So, of course, her experiences don't resonate with you in the same way. Of course, the experiences and self-expressions are going to be different. She might wear a lot of pink, and you might wear a lot of black. Who cares? There's no correct way of being a woman, and there's no correct way of being a man either. Trans people do not erase the existence of cis people. In fact, it's actually transphobia that twists reality, especially when transphobic people unintentionally gender someone correctly, until they find out that they're trans and suddenly switch it up like, oh, I'm sorry, but I just see you as your sex assigned at birth. No, you don't. You just feel the need to be transphobic because we all know that men and women come in countless shapes and looks and expressions, whether or not they fit stereotypical masculine or feminine traits. It's not about biology for transphobic people as much as they claim that's what it's about. It's about clinging to a bias. I am tired of the blatant intolerance and hatred masked by concern for people who are always allowed to express their gender identity. I will never understand how a queer person could be transphobic. Like, how did you even do that? Remember when super straight was a thing? That trend where people claimed their sexuality was being attracted to only cisgendered people, but the whole point being to exclude trans folks? Yeah, wasn't that a weird trend? Well, apparently, it wasn't a trend. Some gay and lesbian folks have decided to create their own versions like super lesbian or super gay. The same criticisms that went against super straight apply here too, you morons. If you don't want to date a trans person, then don't. It's called a preference, not a sexuality. When you start creating identities about being more lesbian or more gay because you wouldn't date a trans person, you're basically invalidating trans identities by suggesting they're somehow less real. It's like those Whole Foods people who swear they're better because they get the organic version of the same exact produce as everyone else. Great, you like organic oranges. Doesn't mean you're any more into oranges than the person who buys them with preservatives. Preferences don't need more labels just to make you feel more legitimate. It's really inappropriate, exclusionary, and honestly, it's just dehumanizing. It's the same reasons why sexualities surrounding preferences for race and age aren't valid either. Why? Because it's fucking weird for the exact reasons I gave. Well, preferences for age are weird for a different reason. There seem to be a lot of labeled sexualities now, to me, look more like preferences. Take sapiosexual, for instance, which means being sexually attracted to intelligence. It started off as a joke, but there are also people who genuinely identify as sapiosexual now. Usually people who spend way too much time online. Because I met someone who identified as both pansexual and sapiosexual. And my first thought was, so you're pan with a type. Because honestly, smart is a pretty subjective thing to be attracted to. I'm only attracted to pretty people, let me come to pride. Just because you have a preference doesn't mean it needs a whole new label for people who really want a box to fit into. That is just my very controversial opinion. Obviously, I didn't say my thoughts out loud to the person who identified as sapiosexual because I didn't really care after the first thought. If you disagree entirely on this specific point because this preference doesn't really harm anybody like how super sexualities do, so it's valid, that's perfectly fine. If someone wants to call themselves sapiosexual, it's really not my business, and I'm not gonna go chase them down over it. It's just the irony that gets me. People will create all kinds of niche labels for preferences of love, which is how people who represent the sexualities that are absent of things like love and sex are constantly dragged. I already mentioned AroAce people before, but for anyone unfamiliar, Aro is short for aromantic, which describes people who experience little to no romantic attractions to others. Similarly, Ace is short for asexual, referring to people who experience little to no sexual attraction. They don't go hand in hand. Sometimes people may identify as one or the other, or sometimes both. And just like any other orientation, these identities exist on a spectrum. Someone can be partially aromantic or asexual, which is totally valid as well. But I've noticed a suspicious amount of people who don't agree with that take. It always comes back to that tired, overused argument that asexuals or aromantic people need therapy to fix whatever's wrong with them. Sound familiar? It's disturbingly close when people used to say that gay folks just need a little bit of conversion therapy to set them straight. And the fact that people are still pushing this idea in 2024? Outlandish. Claiming that it's somehow essential for everyone to experience love and attraction for the sake of procreation. However, just because romantic and sexual attraction are common doesn't mean they're universal. And it doesn't make people who don't experience them any less human. Human diversity includes a whole range of experiences and orientations. Being Aro or Ace is no more unnatural than being left-handed or having any less common trait. People don't need sexual or romantic feelings to live fulfilled lives. Aro-Ace individuals find meaning in other forms of connection, like deep friendships, community involvement, or personal passions. Romance and sex are just two paths to fulfillment among many, so acting as if they're vital for everyone is missing the point entirely. Aro and Ace people are just as valid and complete as anyone else. They simply experience life differently, and that diversity deserves respect, not judgment. And honestly, the judgment doesn't stop there because it never does. Just like Aro and Ace people face the criticism for not fitting into the norm of romantic or sexual attraction, people in polyamorous relationships get cheesed for doing kind of the opposite, having multiple loving relationships. Again, for anyone who doesn't know, polyamorous describes a relationship style where people are openly engaged in romantic or emotional connections with multiple partners, with everyone's knowledge and consent, of course. It's all about open communication, respect, and agreed upon boundaries. Polygamous refers to a marriage structure where people have multiple spouses simultaneously. Poly isn't necessarily about marriage or exclusive family structures. It's more flexible and focuses on maintaining multiple loving relationships with full consent. Nobody bring up boyfriends, please. I believe that poly isn't really a sexuality, because sexual orientation is about who you are inherently attracted to, whether it's men, women, or both, or neither. It's a fundamental aspect of our identity that is deeply rooted in biology, psychology, and personal experience. You don't really choose to be gay, bi, or straight. It's part of who you are. Studies in genetics, psychology, and neuroscience have shown that sexual orientation is influenced by a complexity interplay of biological and environmental factors, making it a core part of someone's identity that isn't just a matter of preference or choice. When it comes to poly, that's more how you want to set up your relationships. I feel like it's more about like preferring a relationship dynamic where you're with multiple people instead of the just one. It's a lifestyle choice, not who you're attracted to at your core. Sexuality to me is more like your taste buds, similar to how people like cilantro and some people don't. Polyamory is more like choosing to eat at a buffet because you enjoy sampling different dishes instead of sticking to just one meal. You might really love cilantro, but maybe you just want to try a bit of everything else too. Not a big deal if you communicate that with your partner. I still believe that people who are poly are still part of the LGBTQ plus community though, because inclusion of the poly relationship dynamics in the LGBTQ plus umbrella isn't just about sexual orientation, but also challenging societal norms around love relationships and the traditional family structure. Like how bisexual and pansexual people may face prejudice for their attention to more than one gender, poly people might face very similar discrimination for loving more than one partner. The LGBTQ plus community advocates for love and relationships beyond the conventional norms. So excluding poly people also undermines the very principles of acceptance and diversity that the community stands for. While poly might be a core part of someone's lifestyle, it doesn't mean everyone has to understand or adopt it either. You don't have to change who you are, but if you're going into a committed relationship, communication has to be crystal clear. If your partner prefers a monogamous setup, it does not mean they're being homophobic. It just means their relationship values and your boundaries may not match up, and that's okay. Do not coerce, convince, or pressure your partner into a relationship dynamic that they are not comfortable with. That is giving poly people a bad rep. One trend I kept seeing is people defending cheating with excuses like she was monogamous and I wasn't, as if that somehow justifies it. If one person wants monogamy and the other wants multiple partners, you need to communicate that privately to your partner. If you are poly, don't get into a relationship with someone who clearly wants a monogamous setup. You are setting yourself and them up for unnecessary drama. The whole point of poly is honest openness and communication, not sneaking around and cheating. If you can't handle being truthful, then maybe a relationship with multiple partners isn't for you. Contrary to what people might think, poly relationships have boundaries too. It's not just a free-for-all where anything goes. In fact, many people in these relationships have strict guidelines to ensure everybody feels respected and secure. Some people set up clear boundaries about friends, coworkers, or family members being strictly off limits for obvious reasons, because crossing a line like that can cause real harm to everyone involved and would absolutely be considered cheating in most cases. Being poly isn't about avoiding boundaries altogether. They're about creating healthy ones that just go outside the one singular partner and respecting them. Just because you wouldn't choose that relationship style does not mean it's invalid. The dynamic between different identities, whether they're bisexual, polyamorous, or have different gender ideology, is what makes the LGBTQ+ community. Using bigotry and oppressions that were once used on you and to instead push it onto someone else is not how you make yourself comfortable and confident in your own identity. You can defend your identity and your existence without the need to question someone else's just because they're different from you, which again is the entire point of pride. The fact that some people turn away from pride and hate being part of the LGBT community because it's too accepting speaks volumes about their own insecurities and internalized intolerance. It's entirely valid to feel disconnected from organized groups like the LGBTQ+ community without rejecting the principles of acceptance, love, and diversity that the community stands for. Not everyone thrives in collective environments, and that's perfectly okay. Yes, the LGBTQ+ community has its own issues just like any other community, but start approaching them with kindness, morality, and understanding so you can actually do good for the community you're trying to stand up for. Alright, that's it. Laters!